He thought it was just another routine stop, a fancy car in the wrong neighborhood, an old man behind the wheel who couldn't possibly belong. Officer Darren Cole had no idea that the man he was about to humiliate had once faced down entire armies, saved countless lives, and carried the weight of a nation's gratitude on his shoulders. What began as an act of prejudice would soon unravel into a confrontation that would shatter his assumptions, test his character, and leave him questioning everything he thought he knew about duty, respect, and humanity. Sometime earlier, the morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of dewy grass and the faint aroma of freshly brewed coffee from neighborhood kitchens. Hal Jennings, seated behind the wheel of his pristine 1990 Buick Riviera, felt a rare sense of calm. He had polished the car the evening before, its emerald green paint gleaming under the pale sunlight. The Medal of Honor pin glinted subtly on his blazer, a silent testament to years of sacrifice and valor. Hal was on his way to the Ridgely Community Center, where he had been invited as the guest of honor for the annual Veterans Luncheon. It was a tradition he held close to his heart, an opportunity to reconnect with those who shared the same battles, the same scars, visible and unseen. As he turned onto Brookhaven Avenue, a road lined with stately mansions and meticulously trimmed hedges, his rear-view mirror filled with flashing red and blue lights. A sinking feeling replaced his calm as he instinctively slowed down and pulled to the side of the road. "Here we go again," Hal murmured, more disappointed than surprised. The patrol car screeched to a halt behind him, its door swinging open with an audible creak. Officer Darren Cole emerged, his hand resting on the holstered gun at his hip. His eyes, sharp and distrustful, scanned the car before landing on Hal. Hal rolled down the window, his movements measured and deliberate. "Good morning, officer," he said with a polite nod, offering his license and registration before Darren could ask. The officer ignored the gesture, leaning slightly forward. "What are you doing in this neighborhood?" His tone was clipped, suspicion dripping from every word. "I'm on my way to the community center," Hal replied evenly. "There's a luncheon for veterans today." Darren's gaze flicked to the military veterans plate on Hal's car, then back to his face. "This is a pretty upscaled area for a car like this. You sure you're not lost?" The words hung in the air like a slap, but Hal didn't flinch. He'd heard worse during his years in the service, and even before that. "I know exactly where I'm going, officer, and I'll never question your decision to evacuate me and my family until you tell me why." Darren's eyes narrowed further. "Step out of the car, sir." Slowly. Hal complied, his movements calm but deliberate, his hands visible at all times. The familiar motions of deference were second nature now, worn like armor. The officer's radio crackled as he called for backup. "Suspicious vehicle on Brookhaven. Need a second unit." Hal glanced around, noticing curtains parting in nearby houses. A couple walking their golden retriever slowed, their eyes darting nervously between Hal and Darren. He inhaled deeply, his military training kicking in. Patience, composure, dignity. "Hey!" The chapter closed with the arrival of another patrol car, its sirens cutting through the silence of the neighborhood, signaling the escalation to come. Hal stood beside his car, his back straight despite the biting cold seeping through his blazer. Officer Darren Cole loomed over him, his flashlight tracing the contours of the Buick's interior. The backup officer, a younger man with a tentative demeanor, hung back, his gaze flicking between Darren and Hal. "Hands where I can see them," Darren barked, gesturing for Hal to place his palms on the car roof. "Now." Hal obliged, his jaw tightening. The veteran in him wanted to demand respect, to remind Darren that he had earned the right to stand tall, unbowed. But the years had taught him that defiance in moments like this only fed the fire. Several seconds passed, and as Darren frisked him, Hal's Medal of Honor pin caught the younger officer's attention. His eyes widened, recognition dawning. He leaned toward Darren, whispering urgently. "What's that?" Darren snapped, his voice rising in annoyance. The younger officer gestured subtly toward the pin. "Sir, I think," he says. "He's a decorated veteran." Darren paused, his hand hovering over Hal's pocket. For a fleeting moment, doubt flickered in his eyes before it was swallowed by defensiveness. "We'll see about that," he muttered, motioning Hal to sit on the curb while he checked his ID. Hal lowered himself slowly, the ache in his knees a reminder of age and battles fought long ago. "Officer," he began, his voice firm but calm, "I've served this country for over 3 decades. I've led men in situations you can't begin to imagine. Yet here I am sitting on a curb like a criminal. Is this really what you signed up for?" All of a sudden, he was transported to the past like a criminal in this simple act of striding to work. "Officer," he began, his voice firm but calm like a criminal. "He is..." The words cut deeper than Hal expected, and Darren's face hardened as if to shield himself from their weight. Around them, passers-by lingered, their whispers growing louder, their phones capturing the scene. Minutes felt like hours as Darren reviewed Hal's ID and ran his plates. The backup officer, standing nearby, shifted uncomfortably, his gaze darting between Darren and the growing crowd. Finally, the radio crackled with confirmation. Hal Jennings, retired Army colonel, recipient of the Medal of Honor. His hand tightened on the radio. Darren returned, his face a mask of barely concealed embarrassment. "Looks like everything checks out," he muttered, avoiding Hal's eyes. Hal rose slowly, brushing off his slacks. "You've confirmed what I already told you," he said, his voice measured. "Now the question is, what will you do with that information?" Darren stiffened, his authority feeling fragile. "Look, I'm just doing my job." "No, officer," Hal replied, his voice firm but devoid of malice. "Your job is to protect and serve, not to judge and assume." The crowd murmured in approval, their phones still recording. Darren's backup officer, visibly moved, stepped forward. "Sir, I think maybe you should hear him out." For the first time, Darren hesitated. The walls of his defensiveness began to crack. At Hal's insistence, Darren reluctantly accompanied him to the veterans' luncheon. Inside the community center, the air buzzed with the warmth of camaraderie. Men and women of all races and backgrounds greeted Hal like an old friend, their laughter and stories filling the room. Darren sat quietly at a corner table, observing. The stories he heard of bravery, loss, and unwavering unity in the face of adversity shifted something within him. These veterans had faced enemies abroad, only to return to battles at home, yet they carried no bitterness, only resilience. Al took the stage, his voice commanding yet kind. "We fought for a country that wasn't perfect," he said, his eyes sweeping the room. "But we believed in its potential, and that potential starts with understanding each other." Darren felt the words settle heavily on his shoulders. The next day, Darren returned to the precinct, a changed man. He approached the chief with proposals for new training programs focused on cultural sensitivity and community engagement. It wasn't an admission of guilt. It was a step toward redemption. Meanwhile, Hal continued mentoring Ridgely's youth, sharing his story not as a tale of victimhood, but as a lesson in grace under pressure. From this page, Hal wrote, "Their paths crossed again at a community event weeks later. Darren approached Hal, extending a hand. "Thank you," he said simply. Hal shook his hand, his smile warm. "It's never too late to learn, son." And in that moment, 2 men from vastly different worlds found common ground, united by the hope of a better future.